good morning or afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're listening from around the world. This is Tim Selden. I'm the president of the Montessori Foundation. With me is my colleague from the foundation, Dr. Michael Dorer.
Hello.
Michael is up in Minnesota where it's cool. Down here in Sarasota, it's too hot for a tie. Welcome back to the third in the ongoing series of talks about the subject of how can you do it all, or rather you can do it all in the affirmative. And last week we were planning to do the second part. We ended up with so many questions that we really didn't get very far. So we agreed that this week we'd pick up with the things that Michael was going to cover last week that we didn't. We still welcome questions, and I'm monitoring. And we look forward to hearing from you all, and we'll just keep trying to do the best we can. I do want to remind you that the content that we're covering in this series of free webcasts is really just the tip of the iceberg. Michael Dorer uses the phrase, a lick and a promise. There's a lot more that most of us need to know to be able to really understand and implement the things that Michael and I are talking about. And really, it's you, Michael. I'm just weighing in from my experience as a Montessori school curriculum developer and school leader for years. You're the elementary Montessori teacher trainer, but candidly, as an early childhood and a secondary Montessorian, the issues we're talking about are really cut across Montessori curriculum. But there is a course that Michael and I will be developing that we plan to launch sometime this fall. That'll be a new addition to the Montessori Leadership Institute, which is a division of the Montessori Foundation. And some of you have already indicated that when that course launches, you want to be part of it. So please know that you're going to have more questions than we could possibly answer in this amount of time. This is about 120 hours plus worth of information that it really takes to digest it. And even then, most people will still be trying to figure out exactly how do you do it in their unique situation. So if you feel like you're not quite sure what's going on, you're in good company. It's something we all have in Montessori. We're learning from the day we begin training to the very last day when we hang up our pink tower. Well, Michael, let's carry on with part 2 of You Can Teach It All.
Really, I guess with the question and answer session last time, Tim, we're probably on part 3 by this point, or 2.5, 2 point something. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it, and thank you, Tim, again, for the kind words. Let me just echo something before I launch off into what I want to say, and that is we really are only touching the surface. That whole content is more than can be touched on in 2.5 sessions online like this. And so I'm going to urge you to really consider the course. It would be an opportunity for us to have an ongoing discussion and conversation about exactly these topics that are almost impossible to grasp in the complete abstract. So with the course running during the school year, you would be able to implement something and then come back and talk about it, and then go back and try something else, and keeping that process up will be rich. That would be a rich process, I think. So enough advertising. Let's talk about, again, teaching it all. This is what we did in the last 2 sessions. These 8 big points. How can you teach everything? Well, you have to do some things, and this I can't emphasize too much. You have to do some things differently than what you're doing now. And some people may think, but I can't get everything done. I feel frustrated, but I like the way I'm doing things. And I'm going to urge you to consider those statements. When you say that and you think that, actually there's maybe a problem. What you need to do is to say, what can I change in order to accomplish the goal that I've set out for myself, which is to be able to offer this whole rich curriculum to my children in the classroom? If you do one of these 8 things, it'll help. If you do 3 or 4, that'll help more. But to really get at it, I'm going to push the idea that you do all 8. Have a curriculum plan. That's the hardest of all because it requires you to develop a curriculum plan for the whole program. But you can access curriculum plans that people like Tim have put together in great detail so that you don't have to reinvent every darn wheel. Have weekly lesson plans, and that's going to be my focus today. Have designated days in which you present material. Monday for geometry, Tuesday for language, Wednesday for history, Thursday for arithmetic, or something like that. That's not a day in which the child is limited to working on that subject, but it's a schedule for us, for me. It's a schedule for the adult in the classroom. 1 lesson per group, per subject, per week. And that's probably one of the things on which I've received a heck of a lot of feedback. And some people think, wow, this is great that I can get by and do this amount of work instead of what I've been trying to do and failing. And others think, oh, this is more than I've been doing. So that made me feel good in that the plan apparently sits in, it's not in an extreme. It sits in between a couple of extremes. You must also, number 5, is to honor the great period. That large chunk of time in the morning of 2.5 to 3 uninterrupted hours that I've decided to call the great period. And I like it because when we give a name to it, we can talk about it without always having to describe it in length as the uninterrupted 2.5 to 3 hour period. That's too many words to, by the time you get that all out, people have lost interest. So the next thing is an open lesson policy. And that's the thing I talked to you about, in which you have targeted lessons for specific people, but the lesson is also open to anybody else in the classroom who chooses to attend. Ready or not, here they come. It should be open to all. Then in the afternoon, I talked very briefly about focus groups. I want to come back to that because that's a different kind of grouping plan that allows children to expand beyond what is possibly offered in the curriculum based on their interests. I used a metaphor of 3 rivers, and the first river was the river of curriculum. The second river is the river of interest, and that's what focus groups address. They specifically try to address that. And finally, I talked briefly last time about guided discovery. So let's go on and talk about lesson planning today, because I think that if we're going to do this, we have to get down to some of the nuts and bolts. Let me say, maybe you may be frustrated and think, but I need more detail. I need to look at exactly what a lesson plan looks like. I need to have practice in filling one out. You're right, you probably do. And the only way to do that is to begin to do it in the presence of children. And maybe you'll make a mistake, and that's okay. But that's another argument for being part of our ongoing class that we're going to try to put together. So my grandma came up with this term, and maybe it came from her grandma, the lick and the promise that Tim referred to in looking at a mama cat with her kittens who gives just a lick but a promise that I'll be back later. And that's what I'm giving you, kind of, is the promise that there could be more if you're interested. Why should we do lesson plans? Let's think about that. So many Montessori people tell me they don't plan lessons. They just are there, ready for whatever comes up in the classroom. They hold it, I'm told, by so many people in their heads. I know where everybody is in the classroom. And I'm here to say, congratulations, but I don't think that's really the case with most of us. I think with most of us, we need to plan things. Why? Well, first of all, lesson plans will fulfill our duty to offer each child the full curriculum. The reason they do that is it makes us honest. Instead of playing favorites, which many Montessori teachers do, favorites among curriculum subjects. When it's laid out in a plan, we can make sure we have balance. And that's one of my points there. I found out, and I bet every one of you, if you're honest with yourself, would find out there are probably some materials or subjects or presentations that you really love more than others. Oh, come on. Maybe even in, say, math, you really love the golden beads more than the teen boards. But does that mean that you should only teach the things that you love? Well, of course not. If you do that, then you're not offering each child the full curriculum. You're offering them your filtered version of that whole curriculum. And I want to say mea culpa because I'm guilty of that. I've done that. And I found the way to correct myself was to take the one subject per day and remember, yes, I'm going to do math, but I also have to do history. I also have to do my biology. I have to do my geometry and so on. And then within the arithmetic, I can look and make sure that those teen numbers are being covered just as much as the golden beads. When you do this, you'll reach everyone. You and I probably know that child who is hardest often to reach in the classroom, believe it or not, is frequently the very well-behaved child who does nothing, who sits in the corner quietly being polite. And you don't notice. You can let that child can slip through so many cracks just by virtue of kind of hiding out, but nicely, without causing a problem. And she may have in front of her a piece of material or materials which are being pushed around and moved. I call that material surfing. They're not really engaging with the materials, but when I look over and I check out little Maria, oh, she's got something in front of her. She's working on the division board, except maybe she's not. She just has it there. So I need to reach everybody in the classroom. Lesson plans, believe it or not, will also create better lessons. You can, I can, we all can improve. We always can. And if we think of ourselves as participants in continual improvement, this is one of the pieces. I also mentioned balance. To me, balance means you give emphasis across the board. You don't fall into the trap that so many schools are into today, in which the 3 R's are the be-all and end-all of education. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. And the history, the geography, the biology, art, music, whatever else, that goes by the wayside. Balance really helps here. And you'll be consistent. You know, and the kids can take it to the bank. Monday, there will be a language lesson. There will not be a gap. It will not be that because teachers fed up with language that we're not getting it this week. We get it on a regular, consistent, ongoing basis, and they can trust you. They build the trust in the schedule, and that kind of trust happens to really lead to a well-managed and well-behaved classroom across the board. Now, horizontal and vertical articulation I've mentioned before, but I want you to know that when you're lesson planning, if you're in a school like Newgate, or a school like Renaissance School in Oakland, or a school like Brightwater School in Minnesota that my wife works in that has multiple classrooms at a given level, by which I mean there's 3 lower elementary classrooms, for example, or 5, or 7, or 2. Horizontal articulation means those classrooms all are following a similar plan, not cloned, but a similar plan, so that you know that whichever classroom your little child is in, she will receive an equivalent experience. It won't be the same because Tim's classroom and my classroom will inevitably be influenced by our own personalities, won't they? But you know that if you come to my classroom or Tim's classroom or Kathy Leach's classroom or whoever is teaching in that school at the lower elementary level, that we will be doing the history of humanity, the timeline of humans and its whole expansion during, let's say, the third year. So no matter which classroom we're in, we may be doing different things with it, but your child is going to be exposed to this particular component. That's across the board. If you don't do this, parents start to vote with their child as to which classroom they want to put that child in because they perceive it as being better or different or more suited to their child. And once that starts happening, admissions and placement can fall into a popularity contest, and that's not good for a school. That's very bad for a school. Vertical articulation refers to sequence. It refers to putting a ladder from the 3-year-old through the 12-year-old, or in Tim's case, the 3-year-old through the 12th grader, all the way through so that year 2 builds on what happened in year 1. And those two things lead into year 3. And then they lead into the 4th year, etc. So that there is a clear sequence that leads from one thing to another. And we're so lucky in Montessori. That's almost built in if we think about following it. Now, I've spent a lot of years as an upper elementary Montessori teacher. And so I would get children in my 4th year class who would come up from lower elementary in the same building. And let's talk about grammar for a minute. Some of them would say, no, we didn't do grammar in our classroom, period. Some would say, well, we did the noun family, I think, maybe verbs. And some would say, oh yeah, we did all 9 parts of speech in detail, and I can tell you every one of the 6 aspects of the adjective, and I can tell you what a possessive adjective is, and I can tell you what all the kinds of cases of the pronoun. How can all those different things be in the same school? And then they all come into the upper elementary with those widely varied backgrounds which have been caused by the teacher. That is the opposite of vertical articulation, where whether they understood everything the same, which they won't, at least every child would have had the opportunity to have been exposed to the 6 levels of the 6 roles of the adjective, for example. So that's vertical articulation. Lesson plans will help us with every one of these things. Every one of these things. Sorry, Tim.
No problem, Michael. Let me just add a point or two. The first is Michael was simply articulating something that some of you have heard me say for years. Clarity is the key to success. Clarity and consistency and integrity. In other words, the idea that every classroom should be built on very similar principles of practice, and that from level to level and from room to room, year to year, decade to decade, your school needs to have a great more consistency than it has inconsistency from level to level and room to room. You can't assume that teacher training accomplishes that. That's done through a lot of work, which is really what Michael is talking about. How you get people, whether they're all trained by one training center or one organization or not, people will have their own different takes on how you implement Montessori. Second point I want to make is parents don't just vote with their children moving from room to room. They vote with their feet. And it's hard enough to convince the average parent that Montessori can be trusted to prepare children correctly for university and whatever's coming next. Frankly, it's much easier for those of us that run a school that goes through high school because they can see the outcomes. They see what the teenagers are like. They see their success in university and as they come back as graduates. But one of the secrets to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish is to ensure that parents have a sense of confidence that your school has a plan and you're really doing things logically, and that they don't see big disparities from one room to the other. We do have a couple of questions that I just want to quickly answer. One
Let
is...
Let's say the very last point here of why lesson plans.
Sure.
We'll go on, because there's an overweening, huge point that isn't on this page. Why should we do lesson plans? Because things get done when they're planned. If they are unplanned, they probably don't happen. Now go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. Diane Gerston wants to know when the recording of last week's webcast will be up. Diane, I have been so busy in this last week raising the money I mentioned. And by the way, as I've been speaking, some of you have been making gifts to the Newgate School or the Montessori Foundation to support the new Montessori Foundation Center and the Montessori High School at the Newgate School, our lab school. So I just want to thank you for your support, no matter how large or how small. And we had, I must say, yesterday, one of our friends at the foundation sent in a check for more than $100,000, and I was absolutely astounded. And we've had lots and lots of people saying, I'd like to do what I can. I can do $5 a month, $10 a month. We appreciate anything anyone does. But the question is, when's the webcast going to be up? And the answer is, I'm in the process of editing after this is over, and I hope that it'll be in there by tonight. Second question that's been asked is from Karen Downing, who said, you mentioned there are curriculum plans out there such as those created by Tim Selden. Where could we access them? Michael may be thinking of something else, but let me clarify. What we have is a curriculum, scope, and sequence that's much more robust than what most people know about in Montessori. In other words, it includes all the missing dropped threads that most people sort of take for granted that Montessori covers. And as Michael knows, because he was part of this whole process, it took us years to update the Montessori curriculum and then to correlate it to the National Common Core standards, and now other, for example, national governments are having it correlated to theirs, and it's being correlated to various states and provinces in Canada. So the bottom line is, those are not lesson plans, those are curriculum, scope, and sequence. And Michael, maybe we could speak about the difference. But that was another question. There are more coming in, but why don't you tackle that one?
Well, I want to go ahead, but let me just briefly say scope means everything that you're going to cover. Scope is like the wide-angle lens that goes on what it is you teach in the school or what it is you hope children will learn in the school. And sequence tells the order in which those things are arranged. And so when you put those together, you've got a document that ideally can start to be broken down in terms of order and year and plan, and actually covers the scope that you aim for. Now, a complete curriculum has other elements in it. One of the most important is a curriculum philosophy in each area. So there's a statement, for example, at the beginning of your math curriculum that says, this is what we believe about math, and this is why we're going to do what we're going to do. That really helps families to understand. You also typically have an outcome statement. This is what we're going to try to achieve. And then with each of those items, what's really critical with sequence and scope is what tools, what materials are going to be used to lead to that. And of course, in a conventional curriculum plan, it's a textbook, and it might say pages 2 through 10, or exercises such and such, but we have materials we can cite. The material isn't the curriculum, it's the tool that is used to help support and implement the presentation of the curriculum. So that material needs to be listed, and then any sort of supplementary things that we have. If you really want to expand that curriculum and do it well, it's good to have a column that deals with higher order thinking issues that can come in with each one of these presentations. Because as you will see when I get to it, developing higher order thinking, or sometimes called critical thinking, is really hard, especially for those of us that grew up in a schooling system that emphasized very simple questions like, what is the capital of Minnesota? And if I say St. Paul, that's right. But the question of why are capitals in major cities frequently built on bodies of water like rivers and on oceans? Now that's a higher order thinking question. So there's a difference between the way I was taught, and probably Tim went to a Montessori school, but I went to a very conventional one-room country school, and there's a difference there between that and what we'd like to be doing today. So that makes it really hard, and so when you're doing a curriculum plan, the more we can do with those questions, the better. And there's a way to do that, but I need to get on with my present agenda because I have a plan.
Indeed. I do want to just, neither Michael or I have any stock in the company, but I do want to say those higher order thinking skills and the scope and sequence, the alignment, it's only found in the Montessori Compass software. So we certainly encourage you to take a look at that. I have one more question before we go on. Jessica Adams is asking, Michael, what do you think about Albanese for consistency and sequence?
That's an uncomfortable question for me because I don't want to be put in the position of either endorsing or criticizing any commercial venture. I don't think Franco Albanese would appreciate it if I weren't 100% supportive, but the same thing with Neon House or Gonzaga Ready or Montessori Compass for that matter. Now that said, I'd like you to evaluate that sequence yourself when you get materials from Albanese. I'd like you to take a look at them and contrast it with the way, not necessarily what's in your album or what was in his album, but the way that your school has your sequence planned and arranged. If you don't have one, okay, use that as an inspiration. But remember, it was made by a human being or a set of human beings, just like you. And you can have the freedom to alter it or change it or develop it or improve it according to your own needs and requirements at your site. So you don't want to be locked into something that somebody else, like maybe Albanese, has generated unless it matches what it is that you're trying to achieve. And in that case, my answer is then it's great. But if you're at odds with it,
we know people that think, yeah, Michael and I know people that love it, and we know others who have different ideas. One thing that you talked about last week, Michael, that I do want to circle back to is the idea that we really only want to give children a few examples of a particular kind of problem.
Right.
We don't want to lead them through a canned series of cards. We want to teach them how to develop their own questions and their own problems and solve them and work together using the materials and each other, checking their work to see, do they really understand it correctly? Can they teach it to someone else?
That's right. That's a really key point. And I want to talk about that more, but I'm going to jump on it just for a couple seconds now. Well, I don't do anything in a couple seconds, but just for a brief moment and say, look, when you introduce a new thing, like, for example, multiplication with the checkerboard, just an example. Some people will have card material with all sorts of problems already prepared on those cards, or conceivably 8.5 by 11 sheets with a whole bunch of problems, which in my mind is simply a workbook cut up into pieces. It amounts to the same thing. Here's what I'd like you to try. I'd like you to try, first of all, giving children no more than 3 or 4 problems, just so you know that they are familiar with the operation of the material. They know, still staying with the checkerboard, they know what the green squares mean, what the blue squares mean, what the red squares mean. They know about what the diagonal pattern means. They understand that and they can function with it. Then you transition to self-created problems. That is, the children begin to develop the arithmetic examples that they will perform on that particular piece of material. And when they do that, you have to trust, and believe me, it may be hard, they will actually ultimately hit on every possibility. If they create them, everything that can come up, they'll discover it. But not necessarily in the order that you would have presented it, and that's okay. That's the spontaneous element that we sing about and chant about in Montessori, that it isn't going to necessarily be the way you would have done it, but it'll still work. And this works with all sorts of things. Take a look at practical life. In Children's House, many of you have a tray, for example, with a piece of brassware on it, like a vase, and a little tub of some sort of polishing material like Brasso or something that's non-toxic, I hope, and some other things like cloths and sponges and whatnot. And the task is to take that to the workplace and polish that brass piece or silver piece or shoe or whatever it is. But from my understanding in the elementary, I'd like to show them how to do that. I'd like to have all that equipment stored in a central storage place, and it's up to the children to look around the room and discover things that need polishing. Like that doorknob looks kind of dirty and grody. I'll go get my material and do it. They are a self-created problem. They determined that needed washing or polishing, and they followed through. And let's face it, isn't that how you would do it at home? You wouldn't sit if you with 2 or 3 pieces of your silverware on a tray, and when you felt in the mood for polishing your silverware, you'd do those same 3 pieces over and over. No. You would think, my silverware looks like it needs to be polished. I'd better do it now. So you have this capability in yourself of self-created problems. We have to give that as a gift to the children that are in our program. So I told you I'd talk for a couple seconds, and I lied. But I was more than probably a couple minutes even. But that idea that we don't have canned problems for them, I think is really essential. And when we do have the canned problems, I probably unfairly refer to that as a card-driven classroom, where the cards drive what happens in the classroom instead of the interaction between the human beings in the classroom driving what goes forward. See, that's what I'd like to see. So I hope that answered that, Tim.
Yep, it sure did.
Yeah, that and more, maybe. Well, sometimes when I talk about lesson planning, people say, but what about following the child? I learned we should follow the child. And what about that? And I'm going to tell you, we are following the child. In fact, more than that, I think we should be believing we follow childhood. And here's how. This is why training emphasizes sensitive periods. So you can understand why we do language at a certain time. We're following childhood. We're following the natural progression of the human being. We also study human tendencies for the same reason. We study human needs for the same reason. We study planes of development for the same reason. That reason is that we can adapt to childhood, but we're not looking at we're not looking at caprice. We're looking at trying to say on a broad scale, what do developing human beings require? How can we best provide that? And then with topic groups, we can say, and if their needs and their interests go beyond what it is that we plan to provide, we have a system to deal with that too, and we call those topic groups or focus groups. So we are actually going to follow the child. But, and this is an important thing, the children especially in an elementary classroom and above, cannot simply work with or study whatever they may please at any time. Maybe you don't agree with that, but they can't just simply choose anything, anywhere, at any time. Why not? Here's why. There's only one person in that classroom who knows how the curriculum, the sensitive periods, the direct and indirect aims, the goals that you have for the work, and the long-term possibilities work together. Only one person knows that. Those 27 children don't know all of these things when they're making that random choice. Who is that one person? Well, it's you. That's why you need to make the decisions. You need to be the person who can say, it's time to work on long division in the group division method. It's time for us to go on to the next vignette in the timeline of humans. It's time for us to unfurl chart number 27 in our geometry impressionistic charts, and on and on. You're the one that knows that. And so you and I and Tim and Kathy and every one of us, I challenge you and I urge you to shoulder that responsibility, to take it on as our responsibility that we have engaged when we say we're going to work with these 24 or 27 or 30 children in the class. So now I'm going to say, let's start to actually plan a lesson. Now, if we're doing this in the class that Tim and I have talked about in the future, I would ask you to bring with you to the class albums that you had in your training program that you can refer to. And of course, with 20 people in the class, we'll probably have 15 different albums. That's okay, because you're going to work from whatever you have. So you're going to have to imagine that you've got that. And there are two kinds of lessons that we are going to be thinking about a little bit. Those are early childhood and elementary. But the focus today will be on the elementary. There are 5 elements in a lesson plan. And this that dates me, doesn't it? This PowerPoint is going to be posted or is posted on the website so that you'll be able to look at these 5 elements and copy them down. And here they are. The title of the lesson, an album reference, a direct aim, higher order thinking questions. HOTS means higher order thinking skills. It's an acronym for higher order thinking skills. Sometimes it's called HOT questions, higher order thinking questions, and follow-up work. You'll notice what's missing here. The actual procedure, the step-by-step procedure for the presentation of that lesson, you already have it in your album. I'm not going to ask you to recopy that back out. Why should you, when you've already spent an eternity in training writing those albums or learning those albums? But these things will keep you honest. So let's look at each one of them. Starting with the title. I'd like you to take the title from your album. Now I'm going to use this example as my example of the lesson that I'm going to do. Okay? Memorization of addition. 3rd exercise, families of numbers. That's the name of an exercise in one of my albums, which I've published under the name of Numbers, which is arithmetic album for the 6 to 9. So as you look into memorization, there's this exercise. That's the name of it. Why bother to write that name? It keeps you honest. And furthermore, those of you out there who are school leaders, who are instructional leaders, that means you're the curriculum coordinator, you're the head of school, you're the head of a particular level, like head of the lower school. Those people who have those kinds of roles can look at that and say, aha, I see what he's doing, and then they can look in your album and they themselves have this reference they can read up and see what it is that you were planning to do. So it gives them a cue. That's really important that there's a name given to it. And here's something that's really hard, but darn it, I want you to do it if you possibly can. And this is going to be the pulling teeth part, or one of the many. There's 32 teeth to pull, so we'll start with this one. And that is that everybody in your school, at some point, should agree on the name of each lesson and each material. If you have that we don't insist, I have to have it my way because that's how it was in training. I have to call it the writing insets. And somebody else says, no, it's the metal insets. And the third person, we call them the drawing insets. For goodness sake, we have better things to do than to argue over that kind of thing. Let's choose a name. And by the way, while we're at it, if there are attributes of various pieces of material, let's decide together what we're going to call those. For example, is the height of a triangle to be called the height or the altitude? Well, yeah, we can give both names to the children, but we're going to regularly refer to one thing or another. It's even down to that thing that I think if we're on the same page, quite literally, that will help children as they move through the school. It will help families as their children are in multiple classrooms and that everybody is understanding similar things. And it will help you school leaders to know what's going on when we have the same shared language. Unlike a lot of educators, we Montessorians have this idea sometimes that because it was taught to me with this particular way in training, I have to adhere to it forever and ever and ever, and I swear allegiance to my program and my language that I learned when I was in training. But we have to understand, if we have 6 teachers in the classroom and 6 different in the school and 6 different interpretations, that was going to signal disunity to everybody. So that's the pill I want you to swallow, to use another metaphor, is let's all get together and use the same language. Once you've got a title, I want you to put in an album reference. This comes from my example there, Numbers, page 171. That's so that the school principal, head of the lower school, consultant, or whomever, can look up what it is I'm going to present, which was, remember, memorization of addition, the 3rd exercise, and they can read it. Oh, I can flip to page 171, and they can hold that in front of them while they're observing in my classroom, for example. Or they can review it in their office at another time to say, oh, I see what he's covering here in this particular thing. So it gives that reference for everybody. Now, the direct name. This I do want you to copy out of your album if it's there, and many albums don't have direct names. So the direct aim is, what are you trying to accomplish with this lesson? What is the goal? What is the major outcome of this lesson? There typically is 1 or maybe 2 real central goals that you're trying to accomplish. For example, in this example 1 from the memorization of addition, the goal is to memorize all addition facts associated with the sums from 2 to 18. Okay, that means that I'm going to focus on those sums, like 10. What are all the addition combinations that I can put together to make 10? This direct aim helps me remember the reason you put it in there is it helps keep you honest, so you don't get distracted and lose track of the aim, the goal, the purpose, the focus of the lesson. That's really easy to let happen. Easier for some people than others. But we can be distracted by things like our own interests. We can be distracted by questions that children ask. We can be distracted by the way a particular child happens to push a particular piece of material around on the platform or on the floor in front of us. And we can lose track of what we're trying to do and go off into another territory. This one reminds me, oh, I'm supposed to be on the addition facts associated with the sums of 2 to 18. But, Mr. Dorer, aren't there a lot of sums that make 100? How many things could we put together to make 100? That's a great question, Juan. We'll come back to that after we've learned this particular thing. And in that way, we need to say to the child, your question is a good question. Your interest is a good interest. But I'm not going to lose track of what I'm trying to accomplish. Now, what are the higher order thinking skills? Because that's going to be the next thing. What are they? Well, there was a guy back in the 1950s named Benjamin Bloom. Bloom like the blooming flower. And it occurred to Bloom that when people talk about thinking, that it might mean a bunch of different things, that everybody wasn't meaning the same thing. Some people meant just remembering that the capital of Minnesota was St. Paul, and other people meant figuring out why they put capitals in certain places, like I told you before. So they used the word thinking to mean all sorts of different things, and he decided to organize the skills of thinking like biologists organize the kingdom, the animal kingdom, and that organization plan is called a taxonomy. So that's the biological term. So he applied that idea and created a taxonomy for these thinking skills. Then in about 2000, he had been working with some young graduate students at the time who by the year 2000 were senior professors themselves, and they came back and redid it. And this is the renewed Bloom's taxonomy from this millennium. And it works up from the lowest level of thinking is remembering. If I ask you, what's 2 plus 2, and you remember that it's 4, that's great. And it's foundational. But it's not higher thinking. It's just recall. It's remembering something. And then understanding is the second level. And this goes on up, and I could do a whole workshop on this, so I'm going to whiz through it. Otherwise, I will be distracted. And I warned myself not to be in the last slide. Applying. Then comes analyzing. Analyzing means looking at the parts of things. That's the central focus if we look at analyzing in the lower elementary, isn't it? When you look at all the parts of the fish and all the kinds of fish, all the parts of geometric shapes and every kind of geometric shape, there's the kinds and the parts are what we do when we analyze things. We're taking things apart. And then evaluating. Now, under the old Bloom's taxonomy, the one that Benjamin Bloom himself came up with, that was the highest level thing. I never understood that. I didn't like it. I thought maybe it was just me. Because I thought, okay, so Michelangelo goes into the Sistine Chapel and he creates an incredible work of art. I've been there. It is incredible. But then an art critic comes in and evaluates it. Was he thinking at a higher level than Michelangelo, who did the darn thing in the first place? Well, the new Bloom addresses that and says, no, the highest level is creativity. Creating is the highest level. And that puts it in the sequence that I find really beautiful for our work in Montessori, because ultimately that means we're targeting creativity as the outcome goal that we'd really like to see happen. And wouldn't we? Wouldn't we really like to see creativity in every field being honored within our schools? So this sequence within the arrow on the right shows it goes from low to high, leads up to the highest level. If you take the class, I'll take time and give you examples from each one, but one of the examples that's really important to think about is that you can create a question that you ask to children or a task that you ask children to do, and inevitably it'll fall into one of these levels. So once you know about them, you can start to strew your questions among all of the higher levels and not end up stuck in that lowest level or two. So typically, people think of the top 3 or 4 levels as the ones that are really higher order, and the lower 2 or 3 levels as not yet achieving the higher order, but that doesn't mean they're not important. You still have to be able to recall things, to understand and to apply, to get to those higher levels. Now, the next step in writing your lesson plan is to actually come up with these questions. And my friends, you know what? This is the hardest step. It means you have to sit down and you have to think, what could I ask children that will require them to come up with an answer that's at a level higher than remembering or understanding or even applying, but certainly higher than those lower 2. What can I ask them? Let me give you this caveat. Don't think you can do that when you are surrounded by a group of 7 or 8 children and you're in the middle of a lesson and you're going to dream up that question at that moment. You're going to shoot from the hip. It's the rare bird who can do that, the rare teacher. Most of the shoot from the hip questions that I've ever heard, and I've been in many, many classrooms and listened to presentations, most of those shoot from the hip questions are of the lower order. They're the easiest to come up with. So when we're under time pressure, guess what we come up with? Lower order questions. Here's a couple that I came up with for this same lesson, our still example lesson on the sums from 2 to 18. I could ask children, if we know that 7 plus 8 equals 15, how could we figure out from that what we need to add to 9 to make 15? And the answer to that isn't 6. I'm not asking 9 plus what? I'm asking, how does that first equation help us to figure out any other equation? So a key to higher order questions is the answer is never one word. If the answer is a number like 6, or the answer is a single word like yes, then it's not a higher order question. That's a lower order question. And that's going to be hard for children when you first implement it. Here's another question that I found to be interesting, that it starts some discussion. Why do you think some number families have more members than others? Well, a number family for this work is a number like 10, and then all of the sums that equal it, 1 plus 9, 2 plus 8, 3 plus 7, and so on. Now, 10 has more members in its family than anything else. Why? Why is that? Why does it have more members than 7? Or 2? 2 only has 1 member in its family, 1 plus 1. So that leads children to try to think about why, instead of me asking, what is 1 plus 1? And the simplistic answer is 2. All right, we're going to move beyond that for higher order thinking. Now comes follow-up work, and this is perhaps one of the things that frustrates me personally, and I'm, as Elvis saying, I'm confessing to you that I get frustrated when I come to a classroom and I see what I think is inappropriate follow-up work. What makes follow-up work appropriate? Well, before I answer that, what is follow-up work? Follow-up work means, the term refers to what it is that you expect children to do after they leave the lesson. What are they going to do with this new information, with this new stuff that you've given them? How are they going to practice the skills, and how are they going to use that to continue to achieve the direct aim? So, in order to know that that's going to happen, this is another tooth puller. In order to know that this is going to happen, The person who is responsible for creating the follow-up work has to be you. You cannot say to children, what do you think you'd like to do? Because that answer may not address the direct aim. In fact, that's not even what you're asking when you say that. You're asking, what would you like to do? But what you really want to know is, what do you need to do? And the problem is they don't know the answer to that question. But you should. You should know, what do they need to do to firm up the understanding of that multiplication problem set that we were trying to do on the checkerboard, or in this case, in that memorization of numbers that equal 2 to 18. What do they need to do? Well, there are a lot of things that they could do. Let's choose 2 of them. Always choose 2 of them. Choose 2 of them. Choose 2. Now, I've said that 4 times, so I hope it's soaked in. Choose 2. It's binary. It's an either or. Would you like to do this or this? Which one will you choose? You could write the numbers from 2 to 18. And underneath, in columns, I want you to write every addition combination that makes up that sum. Okay? Now, I could have an example. In fact, I should have an example for children to look at to say, oh, I see what you mean. Because I found out one of the most common mistakes that's made in follow-up work is that children don't understand what it is that they were supposed to do, so they're not successful with it. Because what you thought you were saying and what they heard you saying don't mesh. So that's why an example is really good. A picture is worth, as you know, the cliche, 1,000 words. So having that example is worth a lot of your words. Now here's the second follow-up work. In your quadrille notebook, draw each sum and the add-ends that make it up. So what I would want them to do is to write a number like 6, and under that they would color in squares that equal 1 plus 5, and the squares that equal 2 plus 4, and squares that equal 3 plus 3, and so on. Again, I'd want an example. These are a little bit different. The first one, the first assignment, emphasizes writing skills. It has to do with writing and computational skills. The second one is positive with children who have artistic leanings, who want to draw, who want to color things. Make sure, if you possibly can, that your 2 follow-up works are different in kind, like these are, but relatively equal in challenge or difficulty, which these are. If one is much harder than the other, children will choose overwhelmingly the easier one. And the feedback, the control of error for that for you is if everybody chooses, or say out of your 7 kids, 6 of them all choose one of the 2 follow-up works, then they weren't balanced. The kids are telling you that. Next time, you need to know those weren't balanced, and you need to do better. That's okay. That's okay. The world hasn't ended, but it gives you the marching orders for your future follow-up works. If out of the 7 or 8 kids in your group, it's split about 40-60, 50-50, something like that, then those are well balanced. Now, I want the children to choose one of those works. They're not giving both of them. Which one will you do? Would you like to write the numbers 2 to 18, and underneath you're going to write every addition combination? Or are you going to get out your colored pencils and draw each sum and the add-ins that make them up? Now, I'm going to test this out, and I'm going to ask Tim. Tim, if you were given these 2, which one would you rather do?
Michael, I've been doing something else as you've been talking, so I'm not going to answer that question. I'll take the one on the top.
I have children like that in the classroom too, don't we all?
Oh, yeah.
So, but I do want them to commit. And when I do this with a group of adults, I ask them, I show them the examples, I say, pick it. And you know what? They tend to split into about 50-50. All right, about half of them want to use the drawing part, about half of them want to write. That's great. But the first follow-up work, of course I want them to work with the material and duplicate what the teacher did. But then we're going to have these examples, these two choices. I've told you to be sure that two works are balanced. And then, get this, do this. You, adult, guide, teacher, you record each child's choice. So I have a form that I could share with you if you take the class later that I've created on which you can record each child's choice. But that's not hard for you to create a form either. To write the names of your children, the subject area, which in this case happens to be arithmetic, and the choice that each child made. And you can number the choices if you want, so all you have to write is choice number 1 or choice number 2. And that way you have a record of what it is that they chose to do. If you'd like to have them write down their choice, that's fine, but you need to have a record too. You have to have somewhere where you've got that recorded, and I call that a follow-up book. So I record that in a follow-up book that's available publicly for any child to go and check and say, what was it I agreed I was going to do again? Oh yeah, I'm going to write the number. I chose that top one, like Tim called it. I'm going to do that. Okay, so that's the recording. Now here is another kicker. Children shouldn't leave the lesson until they've made a choice. If they say, you know what, Mr. Dorer, I want to think about it. Well, then you think about it for another couple minutes and you can make a choice, or I'll make one. Because if you are thinking and thinking and you can't make a choice, then they're pretty equally balanced. Sometimes when I say that, I'll say, all right, you weren't able to make a choice, so I've decided a good one for you is to draw each sum and the add-ins that make it up. And sometimes the children say, well, actually, no, I wanted to do the other one. All right, fine. Now the choice is made and been recorded. Now you can go to work. If children don't make a choice, they're not likely to later. And it might be 2 or 3 days go by before they realize they don't know what work to do as follow-up work, and you don't either. It could even be the whole week. And then you castigate yourself over the fact that Tim never got his work done, but the problem is you and he were never clear on what the work should have been in the first place. So he's not going to get it done unless there's some clarity and understanding. That has to be present. So you don't dismiss the child until the choice is made, and then you have the follow-up book where you record what Tim's choice was and what Jonathan's choice was and what Kathy's choice was and what Marcus chose, and on and on. So that way you know when you come back to the next math lesson that you know what they were supposed to have been working on. If a child says to you, but Mr. Dorer, I love both things, I'd like to do them both. That's a wonderful thing to hear, isn't it? And I always say, that's great. And I tell them, that's a wonderful thing to hear. I'm glad that you like them both. I'm thrilled. But which one are you going to do first? Let's identify one. Let's pick one. Because otherwise you've got them out there flip-flopping again and not really sure where to begin. Have you ever been in the case, throw yourself back to college or high school, where some teacher said to you, I want you to write an essay. And you put your hand up and say, on what? Well, that's up to you. You can come up with it. Many people spend most of their time trying to decide where to begin and what to start with, rather than the actual writing process. They get stymied because they don't know where to start. What was I supposed to write about? Or when do I begin? So we can help that by saying, your choice is made. You're going to do either writing the numbers or drawing the sums. You're going to do one of those two things. And then later you can do the other one. And that way it's clear. And I hope I'm clear to you that this element of choice has to be honored in the Montessori classroom. If you give children one choice, it isn't a choice. If you say, all right, everybody, I want everyone in the class to do 10 multiplication problems with the stamp game, and they're all to be 4 digits times 1 digit. There's no choice there. Everybody's got the same thing. So can we make another assignment of similar difficulty, but different? That's the challenge in coming up with these follow-up works. So that way there is a choice, and the best choice is either A or B. Don't say whatever you'd like to do, because that's, oh man, it's really hard to make the choice. And now you look back at your follow-up assignments that you've been giving, because I want you to record these in your lesson plans, and you look back. If your assignments, your follow-up work, tends to be always of a certain kind, then you're in a rut. And I myself speak from experience because I know what a rut is. I've been in a rut. I started to do this and I discovered something I really like is to make a chart or a poster. Because I look back and I found out my follow-up works over and over had make a large chart that shows, make a poster that shows. I came to this, I thought, why am I thinking so narrowly? Why don't I think more broadly? If I hadn't had these recorded, I wouldn't have had a way to notice that I was doing this, that I was, well, in a rut. So one of the things I'll give you if you take the course is 98 suggestions. Maybe we'll be able to get it up to 100 with your input of different kinds of follow-up work that you can do. Because we do tend to get in a rut and we don't think, oh, well, maybe I could do a diorama with this particular work. Or maybe with this one, writing a haiku would be a good thing. Or with this particular one, I could do something else. Sometimes the choices, the two follow-up works, can seem to be to you almost the same thing. Here's the deal. Let's do some work with the checkerboard. Now, I could give a possible one follow-up work is to do 12 multiplication problems of 4 digits times 2 digits. Got that? 12 problems, 4 digits times 2 digits. All right. The other potential is to do 6 problems of 4 digits times 4 digits. Which would you rather do? The 12 smaller problems or the 6 larger problems? When I've given that to children, again, it splits down. And guess what? In each case, they're doing exactly the same number of multiplications, but they see it differently. So your difference between your two follow-up works can be minuscule, so long as the children perceive them to be different, and they make their choices based on their own perception. Now later, deep breath. I've given the lesson. I've escaped from the lesson intact. It worked. Now I want you to go back to your lesson plan and you do these 3 things. You put down any notes that occur to you of what your impressions were of the lesson you just gave. Now, I do these next 2 things simply with a highlighter. I highlight questions, my higher order questions that worked. Why? Because some of them are duds. I hate to tell you, some of the best questions I've come up with weren't actually good questions. They were duds. I loved them, but they didn't work. And children would sit there and look at each other in confusion. And there'd be dead silence. Well, that doesn't make for a good discussion. So I try to prompt it. Usually I try that question a second time with another group. But if it continues to fail, let's highlight or let's draw a line through that dud question. I don't want to use it again. So I highlight the ones that worked, where they really got engaged. I want to use that question again in future. And the same goes with follow-up. If the follow-up assignments that I gave caused enthusiasm, caused engagement, caused children to like them, put a smile on their face, and caused them to be engaged and learn, that's one that worked. If nobody chose it, it's already a dud. If it was chosen, but it was incomprehensible, somehow it didn't work, you know what? I don't want to give that follow-up work ever again. I may try it twice, but two's the limit there, because I'm not going to go to a third strike. I need, even though I was somehow sentimentally attached to that work, I thought, oh, they'll love it. If they didn't, then it's a dud. Or if they did love it, but they didn't learn anything from it, it was fun, but it didn't lead to anything, well, I'm sorry, that's also not good. So we need to review, what we're doing with these three later things is we're doing a higher order thinking of ourselves. We're evaluating. And that's higher order thinking in itself. So you see, you're actually engaging in this process even as you're doing your lesson plan. That's great. We too can think at a higher order level. Even, I have to tell you, Tim, even at our advanced age, we can do higher order thinking, or we should be able to do higher order thinking.
I certainly would hope so.
How often should you give these lessons? Well, in the elementary class, and I've said this before, 1 lesson per day will cover all of the 6 subjects weekly. If you had to put in another lesson, a 6th, a 7th lesson, or so on, you could. But I want you to create a set day for each subject so that you aren't varying from that schedule very often, unless something comes out of left field. And then you might have to vary from that schedule. So for example, in Thanksgiving week, you might have to vary from that schedule somehow because you might be losing, say, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday are all gone from that week. Maybe you want to make some changes. Or you presented that checkerboard, but it flopped. So I think I need to do another presentation of that same thing because I messed it up before. It didn't work. Then you may have that 7th lesson or 6th lesson for a reason like that. In early childhood, I know I said I was going to do elementary, but if I were to do this in detail with people, I often do a lot on early childhood. You should be aiming at 1 or 2 presentations per week for each child. Now, if you have a class, like a lot of people do, of, say, 20 children to 24 children that are 3 to 6 years of age, that means you're going to do 20 to 30 presentations a week, and that's a lot. But don't tell me, because some people have said, but I learned that I was supposed to do a practical life presentation, a language presentation, a geography presentation, a math presentation. I'm supposed to do, in sensorial, I'm supposed to do one of those with every child every week. Well, now we're gone from 20 or 30 lessons to 100 or maybe 150 lessons per week. You're not going to do it. Believe it or not, I went to one young woman's classroom and she was in tears. She said, I'm trying to do 1 presentation for every one of my children in each area every day.
That's a teacher who is losing his or her mind. Can't be done.
It can't be done. It can't be done. You're setting yourself up for failure. If you can succeed in reaching every child with an individual presentation every week, then you can progress to saying, I'm going to average 1.5. I'm going to try to go up. But success breeds success. So being successful is really important. If for that poor teacher, she felt she couldn't accomplish anything, and she couldn't because of the task she set for herself. It was as if I had suddenly given her the permission to actually do what all along she'd thought she should have been doing. So with early childhood, the problem is you're doing individual lessons with so many people, so you can get swamped really easily. The swamped instructor is not an effective instructor. The swamped guide is not an effective guide. You don't want to get to that point. And if you feel it coming, stand back and look at your schedule of lessons and presentations you're giving to children and reevaluate. It's very, very typical of Montessori people to bite off too much. It's very typical because so many of us are perfectionists and think we can do it all. And then when we can't, we end up beating ourselves with a wet noodle. And that doesn't get anybody anywhere. So I'm telling you, elementaries, 1 lesson per day per subject group per area and so on. That means you're doing 3 lessons, you're doing 15 per week. Early childhood, you're going to do more, but that's okay. They're shorter. You don't have to deal with follow-up work and higher order thinking questions with the 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and mostly with the 5s. So you can do this. Let's go back and say, what were the essentials that I said you had to have? The grade period. You've got to have that grade period. You can't get by without it. I haven't specifically touched on practical life, music, and the arts, but those have to be integrated throughout your lessons. So be sure that when you're giving lessons in math, that you have periodically a musical component, an artistic component, something like that. One thing I learned years and years ago, and it was mentioned in training, but not much, but I've really built on it, is a concept called embellishment. Embellishment refers to the idea of taking the work that children put in a notebook and embellishing it so it becomes beautiful, making every page a work of art. So the math page has color on it, it has drawings, it has beautiful, it's every page. We use the phrase, like the monks of old, that referred, for example, to the monks that carefully made beautiful sacred works. Well, these sacred works are the works that the children are doing in the classroom. And all right, so they're not sacred, but they can be beautiful. Every single page that a child does should be something over which she can have pride and joy and happiness. And so art can come into each one of those. And some of the other things, like music and movement and so on, open up another whole presentation. But those have a place as well, and their place is important in our classrooms. Now a lot of people want to talk about research. That's another whole topic, but don't forget that many research projects can be done right in the classroom. If you want a math research project, for instance, you can chart the exponential growth between all of the short chains, from the chain 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared. Find the difference in value between each of those, and then you can lead to graphing with that, because graphing shouldn't be a separate thing, it should be integrated right in. But you don't have to go to the library to look that up. Material is in our classroom for a tremendous amount of in-class research that children can do. That allows them to follow another Montessori principle, which is called the principle of the conservation of the material, and that is that among other things, it's got 2 parts, but the part I want to talk about is the idea that we want to squeeze the most out of every piece of material that we can. Material should not be aimed at providing one experience, but multiple experiences. That's where you're going to get your ROI. that's something Jono talked about. If you were in on listening to him, that means your return on investment. So you've put a big investment into those materials. If you only get one thing out of it, they do one thing and one thing only, then you're not getting a big enough return on your investment. Focus groups. Gosh, I've come to that many times, and I know our time is short, but you need to have children have the ability to choose areas on which they'd like to focus. And I told you last week, my favorite topic was fashion. It was my unfavorite topic, but it became a favorite. Because that's a clear example of something around which there's a whole bunch of literature, a whole bunch of effort, a whole industry, and it's typically not part of our regular curriculum. But kids might say, I'd like to know more about it. And if they can talk a few others into, let's collaborate and investigate this, we suddenly have the genesis of a focus group, a study of whatever it might be. And another popular one I've had in the class has to do with sports. In sports, may be part of our physical education curriculum, but doing other things with it in the classroom doesn't exist at all. But we may have a whole classroom that has 7 or 8 dedicated basketball fans, or possibly they're soccer kids that really love that, or hockey fans here in Minnesota. That can lead to a focus group. But hockey's not in our curriculum, and it shouldn't be, but it can be a focus that children can follow, because like fashion, it has its own whole industry and literature and people devoted to it. Now, another essential, and I don't want to preach to you on this, and maybe you think I've been preachy, but another essential is 3-year age grouping. You can't get by with a 2-year or a 1-year or a 0 or something like that. And sometimes people say to me, but Michael, if you have a broad skill set in your classroom, they could be all first graders, and it amounts to the same thing as a 3-year age group. No, it doesn't. Because they need those 3 years of experience with you. What the 3-year age group really does is it gives you 3 years to develop a deep relationship with the children, and the children 3 years to develop a deep relationship with you. And Montessori is a kind of relationship-based learning. So building on that relationship is really, really wonderful, beneficial, tremendous, and we have the power to do it. And then the open lesson policy, which I've talked about quite a few times. Now, you can write to me with your questions. I can't guarantee that I'll answer all of them personally, but I can bring them up at a webinar with Tim. If I can, but if it's a detailed question, like, here's the setting in my classroom, and this is the problem I'm having with this particular child, Zheng, who cannot do such, I probably can't prescribe and diagnose from a distance. That gets to be really difficult. But we can talk about things like that in a bigger term, bigger sense with the webinar. So that's a good thing. Now, it says questions, and I've been talking, and we're really late, but is there an overweening question, Tim, that I can deal with?
I don't know that there's anything that's
well,
overarching. The bottom line is most people are asking, there are lots and lots of questions. They're the kinds of questions that really need the course. Let's see if there's 1 or 2 that we can just grab in the few minutes we have. Sarah, let me see if I can pronounce this correctly. It looks like it's Kayali. Says, what advice do you have for teachers who have children with special needs? Well, where are there resource, where there are no resource teachers and no other aid from the school? Well, that's a big topic right there.
That's a topic unto itself, isn't it, Tim? That's a topic unto itself.
We've done a number of webcasts, and there are courses. You can take training as a Montessori teacher to incorporate children with exceptionalities or, quote, special needs in your classroom. My advice to you is that you're going to want to read everything you possibly can, Sarah, about Montessori and children with exceptionalities. I think if you go to the Shelton School's website, shelton.org, you'll find information about the course that they offer down there for teachers with special needs. And I think if you Google Montessori special needs, you'll start finding links, but it goes way beyond what we can cover in a moment or two online. It's a very important topic. By the way, I don't know what age you're teaching, Camila, but the bottom line is there are professional development courses for early childhood and elementary teachers. They're not as thorough as what I think everyone really needs, but go to www.guidedstudies.com. The Center for Guided Montessori Studies offers a few times a year an 8-week course that's online that tries to address as many of these topics as you can, may be of some value to you.
Just a couple of things, too, on that, Tim. I've got two quick things. One is, when you say special needs, that is a broad range, because there are children with physical handicaps. There are children with mental challenges of various sorts, and those can be all sorts of various mental challenges that can be autism or on the autistic spectrum. It can be a learning difficulty with a particular area. It can be just all sorts of things. It can be children who are gifted and they have a special need as well, or talented. And it can be children even who enter your classroom without the English language, who come from a family that is entirely Somali. So there's no one answer for all of these things, and if those are only a few of the kinds of needs, there's no one answer that can address all of them. It's a big question. Dr. Andrews, who is an expert on special needs in Montessori and is a Montessori teacher and a professor in the University of Wisconsin, has emphasized with me, because we work together on a program like that with a school in Utah, and she's emphasized with me that one of the key issues is how many children do you have in your classroom who exhibit special needs as opposed to the typical children. And that should reflect the same kind of percentage that there is nationally. If you have in your classroom of 20 children, 14 who are on IEPs because of special needs, you're going to be strung out. That's going to be a very difficult situation. And you want to avoid that and keep that to a percentage that's more like between 5 to 10% of the children in your classroom.
Absolutely. And of course, there are two things that happen. The first is when you get into elementary Montessori in particular, and in some schools, the families who tend to stay for kindergarten may be similar. You're often going to see two kinds of families. Once public education is available, and even in public education, lots of public and charter Montessori schools see a high percentage of families who have children with exceptionalities being drawn to them because they assume Montessori will be the right thing. So it's not uncommon to get a significant number of kids wanting to be in your program, or in a private Montessori staying in your program. So you tend to get two kinds of families staying: the most sophisticated and committed, and children who have something about them that makes the parents think, boy, I better stick with a winning formula. Ideally, you want to keep your percentage under 20%. I'd say 15%. That doesn't mean you can't handle more, but it is not uncommon, as Michael says, for the average Montessori guide to become overwhelmed if they have too high a percentage of children with exceptionalities. Now, I've seen people who can do it, but you don't want to get into a situation where you're ending up hurting the school's reputation because you've taken on more than you can really handle.
Or maybe not meeting the child's need for the same reason.
I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean.
That would be really unfortunate, but remember what I said. There are a wide variety of needs, so they require different responses. So if you have children, each one of whom has a very different exceptionality, some physical, some cognitive, some emotional, some behavioral, those don't require the same response from you. They require different responses, and that's how you get strung out. That's what happens.
I'm looking at a long list of questions. We're over time, but I'm going to end with one from Norma. This is Norma Melagafeo. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, Norma. What she is saying is, as a school director, how do you make sure that teachers follow lesson plans? Let me offer my opinion as a longtime leader of a school, and then Michael, why don't you do the wrap up, and then we'll close. I would argue, Norma, marry in haste, repent at leisure. You can't make teachers do things. You can offer them support, inspiration, guidance, coaching, but you have to hire people who are fundamentally oriented to do what you have in mind when you hire them in the first place. Because if you don't, if they basically think you're nuts and you're being unreasonable in your expectations, you've already got a problem. It's like trying to teach a basset hound obedience. It's not that it can't be done. It takes a really good dog trainer. My advice to you is understand what you have in mind. When you're hiring for a new position, don't use the pulse test. You know, if it's breathing, hire it. If it's got a bachelor's degree and a credential, hire the right people, and don't wait until the last moment to hire people. There's a whole course that we've run on how to recruit a superstar faculty and coach them into success. This is not a quick topic either, although John Wolf and Andrew Cutt and I have talked about this many times for an hour or so. We just barely scratched the surface. So anyway, that's my first piece of advice there. Michael, to you.
What you said, Tim, that's spot on. That's wonderful that you've said those things. I would add a couple other things. If teachers are producing, if I were head of school, I would say, I want to see lesson plans from you every week. I want to look at the lesson plans. I'm not grading them. I'm not giving you a pass-fail, but I want to know what's going on in the school because I get questions from families as to what's going on. So I need to see lesson plans. Then when you go observe, and the best heads of school are out in the school. They're not in their offices all the time, but they're out in the school. And so when you go out to observe, you can say, I see that in the lesson plan that this was happening this week, and I see it actually happening in the classroom. If it's not, then you are engaged with a phenomenon that talks about the difference between the curriculum as planned and the curriculum as delivered. And those aren't always the same. In fact, usually they're not the same. So the goal is to say, is there a way we can get the curriculum that's delivered to match what's planned? And this isn't a punitive thing. This is a thing where you can sit with the teachers and maybe the plans are not fulfillable or something. So you need to be in the school armed with the lesson plan which references the album so that you can see what people are really doing out there. And that you're there not in a punitive way, but to support them. Now, there's a thing that's called curriculum mapping. And there's different definitions of that, and I'd like to spend some time on that someday. But one thing that you can do is as teachers teach things, you can ask to keep a record of every lesson that's been taught and actually map those, and that will be the curriculum as taught. And that can inform the development of your own school's scope and sequence because you can develop something that matches what can actually be done. And that's really important. So I think the key there is to support the teachers, not setting up unreasonable expectations. And hopefully you've got the right folks there, which is what Tim was talking about, that want to work with you on this. Now, you know what, this has been really great that you're there, and unfortunately there's some questions I didn't get to, but thank you for being here. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, we've got lots more to talk about. So, Michael, what's coming up next week?
I didn't have an idea that it might be me. If it is me,
it's you. It doesn't have to be you, but I thought you were on a roll for the next 5 weeks.
I will. I'm torn because on one respect, I almost think something like last week, where we just sit down and get down and dirty and deal with a question and answer session, is needed every once in a while, because that way you can. Here's what I've learned in the classroom with kids. If they've got a burning question and you proceed on and on and on, they don't come along with you unless you pay attention to the question they had. Then that's out of the way and we can move on. Maybe you're like that. You've got this question, you're just thinking, for goodness sake, Michael, I've sent a question in, would you deal with it? So maybe that's something we should think about doing. And we could open it up to some other areas we've talked about, like the impressionistic charts or impressionism and imagination.
Why don't we, let's just say we're going to talk about questions and answers about making it all work, and particularly making that sense of wonder, what do you call it, the great lessons, the cosmic curriculum, field experiences, going out, that whole bit. We're not going to cover everything, but we can have a dialogue, a real conversation with you all asking us questions. And by the way, Irene Morales says this would be great.
Oh, good. Thank you, Irene.
There's
a wonderful book here for next week.
Got a plan.
A children's book called Sense of Wonder. Go read it. Then you'll be in the imaginative mood.
So why don't you repeat that? I didn't hear quite what that was. Are you telling me you wrote a book called A Sense of Wonder?
No, I'm trying to recall the author. Somebody will probably send it in. He also wrote Make Way for Ducklings. But it's called, I'd see if my wife can remember it, if Rose can remember it. But it's called A Sense of Wonder, and I'm just suggesting that's a really good one for you to look at. No, I wish I had, and I didn't. Rose, are you back there?
McCloskey?
Say it again.
McCloskey?
Does he have a first name?
Oh, I can't.
I think it's Robert McCloskey.
Yes, I'm hearing McCloskey. Kelly Mannion says it's Robert McCloskey. All right, so let's all go get Robert McCloskey's book.
I'm hoping
send out a reminder.
Excuse my memory issues.
Yeah, not a problem. By the way, for those of you who are still online, I'm about to send out an email opening up this year's school and individual family Rosetta Stone subscription basis. So if any of you are interested, we have a limited number available, and if you want, you can save yourself a reasonable amount of money off of what you can get these for from Rosetta Stone. They're normally $200-something a piece when they're on sale. And I think this year they've increased the price on us, but it's still $89 is a big discount from what I think you can get it for at any time anywhere else. So I think that's it for this week. Michael, thank you. I know why we're confused, because we agreed that as your book comes out, either just before or just after, you're going to do a couple of weeks on how to do storytelling, right?
Yes, I want to do at least 2 weeks on storytelling, but I think right this next week we maybe should and deal with the questions, and then we can launch into a storytelling sequence, because I think that as you prepare for the school year, it would really be good to have that tool, the tool of storytelling, in your not back pocket, but right in your front pocket, so you're ready to use it. So yes.
All right. Well, Gosh, everyone, we love you being here. We're glad you get value out of it. And I think that's it for this week. This is Tim Selden and Dr. Michael Dorer from the Montessori Foundation. Signing off.
Take care, everybody.